Welcome to episode 47 of the How to Japanese podcast. Happy New Year. Ake mashite o medetou gozaimasu. 2024. We made it. I've started off the year continuing some of my bad habits. I guess not really the way you want to start, but as far as bad habits go, these aren't terrible. I'm thrifting used books despite the fact that I'm moving apartments soon as in this upcoming weekend, and I really should be downsizing. I have two excuses. One is that I don't really have that much stuff. I downsized pretty significantly when I moved from Chicago to Osaka in 2022. That included lugging about 50 pounds of books on my bike to Myopic Books in Wicker Square in Chicago, where I sold books that were really close to me, including a nice paperback copy of Dance, 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 the one with the cover of the ram in a plaid vest and a necktie and a collared shirt on the cover, which I don't think I realized exactly how rare it was when I sold it at the time, but because when I showed it to the guy, or when the guy came across that book, I think he had a look on his face like, oh, one of these, why is he getting rid of this? And I'm sure that they made a killing on that. I also got rid of a lot of books through Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. And so I don't feel too bad acquiring an additional book right now because I just don't have that many. The other excuse is that the particular book that I've acquired was a used copy of the Alfred Birnbaum translation of Norwegian Wood. And it's a first edition. Well, it's a mixed pair, actually. Because it's 2 volumes, just like the original Norwegian Wood. The first part of that is a first edition. The second part is, unfortunately, a second edition. And this is, I think, probably the last holy grail for Murakami translations. Everything else is now really available. Hear the Wind Sing for a long time was hard to get. Pinball 1973, very hard to get. But now we've had copies of those since 2015. And some of these initial Birnbaum translations, though, are really hard to get these days. If you haven't, you need to read David Karashima's book, Who We're Reading When We Read Murakami. I have a nice blog post about this with some of my takeaways from the book. And I mentioned it a little bit in the podcast on Translation Chat with Jen O'Donnell. And Karashima writes about how Murakami was initially translated for Kodansha International's line of Kodansha English library books. That's the imprint, or sub-imprint or something. I'm not quite sure exactly what it would be called, but I don't have Karashima's book with me at the moment, so I don't have all the details about how this came about in terms of how Murakami was recruited for this line of books, which includes things like The Great Gatsby and other kind of classics of literature that are sold in small bunkobon size paperbacks with some grammatical notes and explanations in the back. They're not that lengthy, so to be honest, you need to have significant English ability to be able to read them. But if there are certain phrases here and there that you might struggle with, those notes would be in the back for Japanese readers or other readers with some Japanese explanations. The one thing I do remember from Karashima's book is that Birnbaum wrote about translating Pinball 1973 before Hear the Wind Sing, and he had a reason he did that. I can't remember why. And then he mailed it off to Kodansha and never really heard back until he got a copy of the translation in the mail, which always reminded me of the way that Murakami kind of mailed off his only manuscript copy of Hear the Wind Sing to Gunzo magazine when that got published. So at some point, these first 3 novels, Hear the Wind Sing, Pinball 1973, and then Norwegian Wood, were all translated for this Kodansha English library books. And this is different from the translation of A Wild Sheep Chase, Dance, 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 and Hard-boiled Wonderland and Into the World, which all were done for Kodansha International. But they remained in print for quite a while, especially Hear the Wind Sing. That one was definitely on shelves of bookstores in Japan for years and years and years, and including through the early 2000s when I first visited, and into the 2010s. All of them in the same bunkobon format, as I mentioned, with the same covers as the Japanese version. So Hear the Wind Sing and Pinball 1973 have these great Sasaki Maki covers with his art, and Norwegian Wood has the 2-volume red and green Christmas themed print that was just like the Japanese one. Pinball 1973 went out of print at some point. I don't know why that is, to be honest. But then it came back into print around sometime in the late 2000s. I have a tweet from 2010 where I must have realized that it was back in print and available, I think, on Amazon Japan. There's a link there that's now gone. That doesn't go anywhere on Amazon Japan. But Norwegian Wood went out of print at some point for this Kodansha English Library, and never went back into print. And that might have been because the official Jay Rubin version of the English was published in 2000. And so I imagine maybe that was the point when that one stopped being printed and wasn't available. But now they're all kind of unavailable. You can find used versions of them on Amazon Japan, but they're not, I don't think that they're still on shelves. I haven't checked recently. Every now and then I'll take a kind of look because they're in a kind of certain area with all the other Kodansha English Library books. But if you're in a Kinokuniya, in the next couple of months in Japan, take a look because you might be able to pick up a copy for pretty cheaply. But I imagine that maybe the availability now of the Ted Goosen translation of Wind Pinball, the kind of double feature that was published in 2015, means that, one, there's no longer a demand for it, and two, maybe there might even be some other reasons, legal reasons or something, why they can't be published anymore. For the Norwegian Wood translation, I got a copy of this off eBay at some point in the early 2000s for, I think, around $100, which felt like a steal because at the time, Pinball 1973 was selling for around $500. It just was not available anywhere in English, and people who were in the know or Murakami fans were, I guess, bidding up these the few that were available abroad on eBay. Within Japan, I don't know what the situation was like, but I think it is really interesting to look at the market for these books these days, both in Japan and abroad. So when they were initially published in Japan, they were very cheap, like most Japanese paperbacks. They were about 460 yen, I think. I found on the cover of one of them. And if you go to the website Mercari, which is Mercari in Japanese, it's kind of the eBay of Japan, except I would think much easier to use, and it's not auction based. They also have a great app, a phone app. And if you search for first editions of Pinball 1973, it shows that they're selling from anywhere from 3,000 yen to 13,000 yen, which, I would pay, I think, 3,000 yen if I didn't already have a copy. I think I would pay that. That seems like a pretty reasonable price for a book like that, especially if, I paid maybe 3,000 for one of the reprints from the 2010s. If it's one of the original ones, from whenever it was first published, I can't remember the exact year. I have a feeling it was a couple years after Norwegian Wood, so it would have been like 89, 91, something like that. But if it was one of those, I think I would be willing to pay a little bit more for it. I don't think I would be willing to pay as much as it's being offered at Shapiro Rare Books on Bond Street in London. On their website, they have one on sale for £650, which the exchange rate currently puts at 121,900 yen. Yes, that's Juniman yen. That is quite a lot of money, and I think I'd rather spend that on something else. Other than a Murakami novel. On eBay, the cheapest copy is $54, so 7,800 yen, and they go as high as $1,400. And at that point, to be honest, it just feels like a staring contest with the owner of the book, the seller, just kind of staring out and not being willing to blink whatsoever. That I don't think you'll ever see those actually sell for that much money, because again, who would pay that other than somebody who's just an extreme fan of Murakami or a rare book collector? Because there are perfectly decent translations of these books that are available both digitally and physically, and don't cost nearly as much. Copies of the Norwegian Wood Birnbaum translation of Norwegian Wood are similarly priced on eBay. And so my question, I guess, is why the variation between Japan and the U.S.? Obviously, the ones in Japan aren't cheap, but they're not quite as expensive as in the U.S. and elsewhere. The range is slightly lower. It starts lower, it ends lower. And why is that happening? I've got a couple theories for this. One, it could be amateurs versus professionals. Maybe there are more amateurs selling on Mercari and more professional sellers selling on eBay. Mercari does feel much more like rolling up to a kind of garage sale in a small neighborhood, or finding a kind of small unknown thrift store where you might potentially be able to find some kind of treasure. As an example, I was able to find a used humidifier. This is now that I'm telling this story, it doesn't really feel like a treasure, but it felt cool at the time because I had like looked into the specific type of humidifier that I wanted and found it on a list of kind of not a consumer guide, but it's the site called mailto, which is a kind of rating site, the kind of closest thing they have to the Wirecutter in Japan. And so I found the one that I wanted, and it was like ni or samayen, 20,000, 30,000 yen. And I was not going to pay that much for a humidifier, but found it on Mercari, maybe a year or two old model for like 3,000 yen. So it's that kind of environment on Mercari. And so maybe that contributes to the price variation. I think another factor is that the market for these books isn't in Japan. The market for these books is largely outside of Japan, where people don't read Murakami in Japanese, they read him in English. So there's not a perfect matchup between buyer and seller, I think. And if there was, maybe the sellers in Japan could demand higher prices. But again, there's an availability of translation that maybe your average reader doesn't care about. They're not a stickler between who's translating it. It would, again, have to be either a Murakami nut who's already read one translation, wants to read the other, or someone who's into rare books. And I think another thing to think about is that there is a kind of here again, gone again history of these translations, the particular translations that's probably kind of confused the market a little bit. Hear the Wind Sing, was in print for a long time, several decades. And so you've got varying degrees of rarity, I would say. Obviously, a first edition is going to be more valuable than something that was published in 2007. And the same is true for pinball. You've got these two very distinct eras of printing. The Norwegian Wood one, I think, is maybe the clearest in terms of value. Although maybe arguably no. Maybe those initial pinball publications would be a little bit more valuable. But at any rate, especially now with these other new translations on the shelf, it kind of confused the market, I would say, and made it difficult to get the value that maybe they're actually worth. And then also the last thing to kind of realize is that Japanese books, I don't think, hold value in the same way that maybe books do abroad. I will always remember going to the Murakami signing at the New Yorker Festival. I think it was 2003. I always forget exactly which year it was, 2002 or 2003. And just being there with my paperback of Hard-boiled Wonderland, kind of on a weekend trip to New York by myself for the first time, kind of just totally fish out of water. And somebody there had a first edition of the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, and I saw it and I said, "Oh, that's a first edition," because I knew the Chip Kid cover. And he goes, "Oh yeah, I've got first editions of all of these." And I was like, "Oh wow." And that kind of made me feel really out of place. But at the same time, I was studying Japanese and I could read some Murakami a little bit at that point. So I felt still a little bit cool. So yeah, I think, books in Japan, unless they're really, really rare, just I think don't appreciate and value the way that maybe books do back in the US or in other countries. One maybe potential exception for this, I don't know, maybe it's not an exception, is that I did see a first edition of the English translation of Dance 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 on Mercari right now for 45,000 yen on offer, although I don't think that's going to be selling anytime soon, to be honest. I don't think there's a market for that there. But again, there's plenty of sellers who are just out there to kind of stare down the market, I think, in on apps like Mercari and eBay. So the reason I think why I bring this up, and I wrote about this on the blog this month actually, is that 2024, this year, we get another update to a Birnbaum translation. So there's more potential for these Birnbaum translations to get increasingly rare, or maybe draw attention because of this update. So as has been mentioned very quietly in David Karashma's book, and I don't know about anywhere else, to be honest, in terms of the media, Hard-boiled Wonderland and the End of the World is getting a Jay Rubin translation that will be published on September 17th, 2024. And I saw someone tweet about this. I think Alison Fincher tweeted about this, and I wasn't quite sure where she was getting the information, and I didn't really bother to track it down until I saw this Alfred Birnbaum translation of Norwegian Wood pop up on my Mercari. On Mercari, the one thing that I didn't mention about Mercari that's really great is that you can do saved searches. And so you save a kind of search, and then when you load up the app, you can kind of very easily see what's been added to that category since the last time you logged in. And I initially checked maybe like last fall at some point and saw that a Birnbaum translation of Norwegian Wood had been sold for 2,800 yen. And I was like, oh man, that's nice. I would probably buy it for around that price. And so I guess a week or two ago, I saw that another one was online for 4,000 yen. And I was like, oh, let me see if I can negotiate it down to 3,000 yen. And I offered 3,000 and didn't get a response. And literally the next day, one was offered for 2,000 yen. And that one actually happened to be partially first edition. And so I just snatched that one up. And that got me wondering about this Jay Rubin translation and of Hard-boiled Wonderland. And so I started looking into it a little bit more, and I couldn't find anything. There's no news. There seems to be no announcement about this translation. The publication will be through Everyman's Library Contemporary Classics. That's the imprint. It's not through Knopf or Vintage, which are Murakami's traditional publishers. And as far as I've heard, the original Birnbaum translation will remain in print. And really bizarrely, Everyman's Library Contemporary Classics has a website, and there is a kind of placeholder image for the book, and it's the same kind of placeholder image they use for all the books that don't have covers yet, or at least that's what it seems like. It's this kind of like yellowish color with the title of the book and the author and the translator. And it also says there will be a foreword by Murakami, which is very exciting. But it's on their website, and there's links to this on my blog. If you click on the link to the book, it takes you to the vintage site, or the Penguin Random House site, for the Birnbaum translation, which is so funny right now. Because effectively the Rubin translation, I don't think is intended to replace the Birnbaum translation, but it will be very interesting to see how it's received and whether it's received that way. I don't think it's intended to replace it, perhaps. But while looking for information about this release of this new translation, I did find a talk that Jay Rubin gave at Wellesley in April 2023. Murakami was in residence at Wellesley for, I think, a year. And so I think it kind of coincided with Murakami's time there. And Rubin provides some really interesting details about the new translation. Also, this video only has like 900 views for some reason, which is crazy because there must be more people interested in something like this, like Jay Rubin talking about not only Murakami and this new translation, but also his kind of translation experience in general and theories about translation and doing translation. But go and watch it. It's fantastic. And there are a couple other details that I'll mention. The first is that Rubin says that Murakami approached him about doing the translation in 2018, and that Rubin finished it 2 to 3 years ago. And that would put it right around the time when Murakami started working on his latest novel, The City and Its Uncertain Walls, which is, of course, a rewriting of the novella that Murakami used as the basis for Hard-boiled Wonderland. So that kind of coincides with my initial theory that it was this retranslation that got Murakami thinking about this book again, and is one of the reasons why he decided to rewrite it. Although, again, we know from a 1994 interview that Murakami was never really able to achieve what he wanted to with the content that he was working with the raw material that he was working with for both the novella and Hard-boiled Wonderland, and that he kind of always was, it sounds like, harboring kind of the idea that there was something he wanted to get out of it, and that he thought he got it with this new novel. I don't know. I would say he didn't. But I think we're going to learn a lot more about the translation and his process, why it happened, how it influenced the new novel in the foreword that Murakami wrote to this translation. So very curious to see how that pans out and what he says there. From Rubin's talk, we also learned that he translated kokoro as heart and not mind. Birnbaum translated it as mind. And so you have this, a librarian without a mind. All the people in the town do not have minds. So here it will be a librarian without a heart, and it'll be a town full of people without hearts. So this will be an immediate way to kind of differentiate the two versions. And it strikes me a lot like the kind of boku watashi dynamic in the original Japanese, where you've got, these alternating chapters narrated by two different first-person pronouns. One, boku, narrates the town sections, and watashi narrates the sections in Tokyo, in real Tokyo, Hard-boiled Wonderland Tokyo. And so kind of in that same vein, this heart and mind will be a way you can look at a passage of the text and know immediately which translation is which. Although I'm sure there'll be, lots of other things that will differentiate them as well. One other thing to look at will be, does Rubin translate it in present tense or past tense? That's the other thing that Birnbaum did is that he translated the End of the World sections in present tense and the Hard-boiled Wonderland Tokyo sections in past tense. And Rubin really admired that technique. He's written about that in his book, and likes that as another parallel to this boku watashi dynamic. And so I'll be curious to see if he does that or if he sticks with the Japanese. And then another thing that I'm curious about is that, is he translating from the 1985 manuscript or the manuscript that was published when he published his complete works in, I think, 1991, and the edits that Murakami makes there. So very, very curious to see how that pans out. Going to be really interesting, and I can't wait. It's going to be great. The video is worth watching in whole. Go and check it out on YouTube. Rubin also he responds to some questions from the audience, including the kind of questions that obliquely hint at the question that's been bouncing around online in the last couple weeks, which is, should good translation be good English or capture the Japanese well? And the implication is that you can't do both at the same time. This has been mostly directed at manga translation, and I think is often leveled at game translation. And I think the idea is that the kind of underlying premise is that good English is necessarily a departure from the Japanese. So that if you're writing entertaining, good, fun English, that's not what the Japanese says, and I'm not getting that real meaning from the Japanese. And then there's a couple other questions that are very interesting that Rubin gets at. Worth a watch. So, at any rate, it's difficult to imagine that this new translation is not going to be a departure from Birnbaum's approach. Birnbaum's approach, I think, you can check out my complete look at his translation that I blogged for 6 years. Man, I didn't even think that I could do another set of this exercise now with the Rubin translation. Oh, that's a little bit depressing now that I think about it, but that could be something that I could do. But I do think that Rubin's will include the entirety of the book, sections that Birnbaum and Elmer Luke cut, and so this new translation will be warts and all the complete novel. I'm almost certain of that. We'll see how much of Murakami's cuts it includes, but or whether it just uses the version that Murakami put out for his complete works. So yeah, go ahead and check out the longer piece that I wrote on the blog about this. It really felt more like a howtojapanese.com piece rather than a Substack newsletter. And the one thing that I realized after I wrote it, like kind of looking through some of the blog posts, is that Murakami, in the Karashima book, Murakami does state to Karashima that he's interested in getting new translations of his early works. I think kind of that being the early Birnbaum translations. And this really brings up a question that the Neo-Japanism Twitter feed brought up in 2014, so 10 years ago. So Neo-Japanism is a web journal run by David Marks. And I think David likely tweeted this question, but he asked, why is Murakami trying to erase every last Birnbaum translation? And this must have come right when the Ted Goosen translations of Hear the Wind Sing and Pinball 1973 were announced. Those were published in 2015, so I imagine that's right around that time. But up to that point, Norwegian Wood was the only one, I think, that had been replaced. And so I think this tweet from Neo-Japanism really had a lot of foresight and kind of questioning why put out a new translation of a relatively recent novel when you already have perfectly good translations. And now we've got a third, we've got, Norwegian Wood replaced the Birnbaum translation of Norwegian Wood, then the Goosen translations of Wind and Pinball, which I guess technically are 2 and 3. So now we have a fourth, really, to be honest. And we'll see what comes next. If Murakami really is interested in getting those translations updated, we could see A Wild Cheap Chase and Dance Dance Dance. There might be a market for it. If I was a U.S. publisher, I would be thrilled about this new Hard-boiled Wonderland one because the original is such a good translation and it can only drive sales, I would imagine. I think anyone who stumbles upon the new one is going to be curious. If they like it, is going to be curious about the old translation. And anyone who loves the old translation is going to want to see what Jay Rubin, who's done so much other Murakami, does with the new translation. But unfortunately, however you look at it, really, it does mean these Birnbaum translations, I think, really are starting to become artifacts in the literal sense, in that they're going to be hard to track down. They're not going to be available digitally, especially the Hear the Wind Sing, Pinball 1973, and Norwegian Wood, those three. And that's a shame. I think, it would be nice if they could be kind of more permanently captured somewhere. So I hope that at least libraries are looking into copies of these if they don't already have them, and making them available for students who could study the translations and learn from them, learn about Murakami. And then for the rest of us, fortunately, we're at a moment right now where they can be found for relatively decent prices, historically speaking, knowing that Pinball 1973 had the ability to draw a $500 price tag at times. Right now, they're selling for much less than that, 2,000 yen, like I said. To go out there and check it out, I would say go ahead, buy them while you can if you haven't read them yet. And if you need help getting a copy, let me know. I'm sure we can work out a trade. I'm glad to watch Murakami. And for whatever reason, it's been the last week or two where these have gone on sale. I've been watching for a couple months now, kind of on and off. And for whatever reason, the last couple weeks, a couple have popped up. So let me know. But yeah, it's a moment in the history of Murakami, I think. Birnbaum and Elmer Luke, the editor for those first few novels at Kodansha, really helped generate that initial promise for readers that Murakami was this new, exciting author. They helped give him a voice, and build a readership that then Jay Rubin and Philip Gabriel were able to carry on for another generation, to the point where publishers no longer determine what's getting translated and when. Murakami does. I'm sure that he could really have anything he wants translated and published. It's just a matter of whether he does, and if he can find a translator to do it. And I'm sure translators would be lining up to help him out there. So go take a look there. And then just briefly, I'll touch on my newsletter post. It's on a totally different topic. It's about Mitsumori. Mitsumori is the Japanese word for estimate. I probably should have written a little bit about the why it's called Mitsumori. That I can't tell you right offhand, but this is the word for estimate. Estimate or quote, I think, is probably the word that is used more naturally in English, but estimate is often that kind of dictionary definition. I haven't written anything about this on the blog in the past. I checked, and that surprised me a little bit because I dealt with so many estimates as a project manager at a small translation company right after JET, but for some reason that word didn't come up on that initial kind of blogging when I was living in Tokyo. But it's come up for me in the last month because I've been dealing with so many Mitsumori for moving apartments. Mitsumori for new appliances, Mitsumori for a moving company, Mitsumori for, most importantly, an air conditioner. That was the real headache. I had to buy an air conditioner for the first time in Japan because I'm moving into a slightly bigger apartment. And it was a bit of a headache, I had to do a lot of, footwork and go into a lot of stores. I would not recommend going to one of the big places like Big Camera or Yodobashi unless there's something really specific that you want and there's a very specific price that you want it for. I would say you're not going to have a good experience, especially with something like an air conditioner, because they'll sell you anything, including something that won't actually fit in your apartment, which is why you have to do something like a genchi chosa or a shitami. Genchi chosa literally means location inspection, and shitami is kind of like a preliminary inspection, advanced look. Shitami feels very similar to shitagaki, which is a rough draft. But with an air conditioner, you got limited space where it can be installed, like on your balcony. And even if you have a balcony that's nice and big, sometimes there's these like installation places that they have to fit within, or you'll have to pay extra to have it kind of lodged securely to your roof or something like that. But in my case, we ended up kind of working with this really nice salesman at a smaller electronics store, Edion, which is where I bought my washing machine last year. And they had pretty good warranty service. They came out and did 2 quick fixes for my washer, which was leaking. And they were able to send someone to our new apartment to kind of do some measurements. And then we were able to negotiate that with them on the price even further because we were in the end limited to one specific type, one specific brand of air conditioner because of the size of the balcony where we'll be living. So yeah, I would say Mitsumori are critical. You can kind of, they're helpful, especially if you want to lock in a price. If you see a price and you say, okay, I want to lock that in right now, let me see if I can get a Mitsumori for that, because they'll generally last for about a month. The other place that I'd recommend is Nitori. Nitori is the kind of maybe like a Japanese IKEA almost, except not quite as massive. A combination between like IKEA and also the Container Store, if you're familiar with that one in the US. They've got just about everything, and just about everything is, I would say, of reasonable quality and of reasonable price. And their air conditioners, I think, were actually pretty impressive, to be honest, in terms of the features that they had and the warranties that they offered. So I would use that as a baseline. Get an estimate from Nitori, get an estimate from one of the big box places, Yodobashi or Big Camera, just as a kind of upper line, because they'll try and upsell you, and then you'll know those kind of min maxes, and you can kind of go for somewhere in between. That's what worked for me. But that word Mitsumori was kind of in my mind all month, and so that's what I wrote about over on the newsletter. Go give it a look. And so yeah, nice short newsletter for this month. A little bit of a longer blog post for this month because the Murakami thing came up, and I'll be moving house this upcoming weekend, and hopefully, getting this one out soon or a little bit earlier in the month, giving me some time to get an advanced start on the February newsletter. So keep an eye out for that. And I hope you all are having a nice start to the new year.